The send button made a pathetic hollow click. That was it. The exact audio accompaniment to my life imploding. I meant to attach the quarterly structural analysis for the Meridian Tower project. Instead, I dragged and dropped a meticulously color-coded PDF of my biological undoing, my personal medical calendar, annotated by my endocrinologist, with the projected dates of my next heat cycle highlighted in aggressive red. The recipient, Julian and Marcus Ashford. The men who signed my paychecks. Twin alphas who normally looked at me like I was a mildly interesting blueprint they'd already memorized. The server lagged. The recall failed. Now they knew exactly when I'd break. My apartment smelled like burnt coffee and the faint chemical tang of architectural vellum. It was 1:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, the kind of hour where the human body stops producing rational thought and just runs on adrenaline and spite. I was staring at the glare of my laptop screen until the spreadsheet lines began to vibrate into abstract art. My eyes burned, a dull, pulsing ache had settled right behind my left orbital bone, a side effect of the industrial-strength suppressants I'd been swallowing like breath mints for the past 6 years. Being an omega in high-end structural architecture wasn't a death sentence, but it was a logistical nightmare. You didn't broadcast it. You managed it. You filed it away under chronic inconveniences, and worked twice as hard to prove you weren't ruled by lunar cycles and pheromones. I'd built my entire career on that premise. At 29, I was the youngest senior architect at Ashford, and I'd gotten there by being ruthlessly, obsessively professional. Julian and Marcus Ashford demanded perfection. They were the founding partners, identical twins, 36 years old, alphas whose presence took up all the oxygen in a room without either of them having to raise their voices. Julian was the strategist, the one who saw the big picture, who could map out a building's entire life cycle in his head before anyone else had even sketched the foundation. Marcus was the enforcer, the one who made sure every beam was placed with surgical precision, who could spot a structural weakness from across a construction site. Together, they were terrifyingly complete, two halves of a single, immovable force. They smelled like different sides of the same storm. Julian carried the sharp, clean crackle of ozone, like the static charge right before lightning splits the sky. Marcus was deeper, crushed cedar and wet stone, the scent of ancient forests after a downpour. I hated their scents. Mostly because my traitorous biology didn't hate them at all. My suppressants muted the world to a dull hum, but even through the chemical fog, those twin alpha pheromones cut through like a blade. I rubbed my face, the stubble on my jaw scratching against my palms. Just send the damn file, Nico, I muttered to the empty room. My fingers were stiff and clumsy from cold and fatigue. I clicked new email, typed Ashford, and the autofill did the rest. Subject line, final revisions, Meridian Tower. I clicked the attachment icon. My desktop was a graveyard of poorly named files, a chaos of final_v3 and structural_analysis_actual_final. I saw the PDF titled schedule_final_revised, clicked it, hit attach, and pressed send. Click. I leaned back, a heavy sigh rattling in my chest. Done. I reached for my mug of cold, sludgy coffee, bringing it to my lips. My eyes drifted lazily back to the sent folder, just to verify the upload. My blood stopped moving. The attachment wasn't meridian_structural_analysis.pdf. It was nico_medical_schedule_final.pdf. The mug slipped from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into 3 large pieces, cold coffee splattering across my bare feet. I didn't feel it. Cold, nauseating sweat erupted across my scalp. No. No, no, no. I slammed my hands onto the keyboard, lunging for the undo send option. The little yellow banner at the bottom of the screen had already faded. I clicked wildly into the sent email, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it ached. I opened the attachment. There it was. Not blueprints. Not load-bearing calculations. It was a calendar, my calendar, annotated by my endocrinologist. I detailed my daily dosage of synthetic inhibitors, my baseline pheromone levels, and circled in a glaring, undeniable red highlighter tool, the projected dates of my next heat cycle. Starting this Saturday. A 72-hour window where I was legally mandated to stay home, lock my doors, and ride out a feverish, humiliating biological imperative. A window I had meticulously requested PTO for, claiming I was attending a regional design conference in Chicago. I tried the server-side recall. I clicked the button. A little loading wheel spun, it spun for 10 seconds, then a sterile gray box popped up, recall failed. The recipient has already opened this message. They were awake. At 1:49 a.m. And they were reading it. Both of them. I sat in the dark, the blue light of the screen washing over my face. My breathing sounded loud and ragged in the quiet apartment. My scent, usually tightly coiled and masked by a sharp, clinical soap, spiked with sour distress. It smelled like bruised apples and panic. I could taste it in the back of my throat, acrid and humiliating. I didn't sleep. I spent the next 4 hours staring at the ceiling, mapping out my resignation letter. I imagined the pity in HR's eyes. I imagined Julian's jaw tightening, his pale gray eyes going cold. I imagined Marcus's dark gaze flickering with something that might have been disgust, or worse, disappointment. To alphas of their standing, an omega's unmasked biology wasn't alluring. It was messy. It was a liability. By 6:30 a.m., I was in the shower, scrubbing the cold sweat off my skin until I was red and raw. I popped 2 suppressants instead of 1, dry swallowing them. They tasted like chalk and battery acid. I tied my tie, a deep charcoal silk that matched my suit, and put on my armor. I would go in. I would hand in my key card. And I would leave with whatever dignity I had left. The subway ride was an exercise in sensory torture. Rush hour in the city was a crushing wave of damp wool, stale perfume, and the overwhelming, aggressive musk of unbothered betas and alphas. Usually my suppressants muted the world to a dull hum. Today, because of the double dose, I felt strung out, hyper-aware of every shift in the air, every accidental brush of a stranger's shoulder. My skin crawled. My scent was barely contained, leaking out through the chemical blockade like water through a cracked dam. I walked into the Ashford building at 7:45 a.m. The lobby was a monument to the twins' aesthetic, brutalist concrete, sweeping expanses of glass, and absolute clinical silence. It felt like walking into a mausoleum. I swiped my badge. The light turned green. A tiny mercy, they hadn't locked me out of the building yet. I took the elevator to the 45th floor. My desk was in the outer ring, a sleek minimalist setup that guarded the frosted glass doors of the twins' corner office, a sprawling double suite separated by a shared conference space. The floor was mostly empty, save for a few overachieving junior architects who'd beaten me in. I set my bag down. My hands were shaking. I shoved them into my pockets. I looked at the frosted doors. The lights were on. They were already here. I sat down and booted up my computer. My inbox was empty. No demanding emails. No, see me immediately, messages. Just, nothing. The silence was worse than a reprimand. It was a vacuum, sucking the air right out of my lungs. At 8:15 a.m., the intercom on my desk buzzed. The sound made me jump, my knee cracking painfully against the underside of the desk. Nico. It was Julian's voice, low, resonant, distorted by the speaker but still vibrating in the pit of my stomach. He didn't use titles. He never had to. Conference room. Now. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my slacks. I walked the 30 feet to the glass doors like a man walking to the gallows. I knocked twice, a formality that felt absurd given what they'd seen. Come. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The immediate change in air pressure made my ears pop. The Ashfords kept their office cold, 66 degrees year-round. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was their scents. They saturated the room, Julian's sharp, cracking ozone and Marcus's deep, crushing cedar. Together, they bypassed my conscious brain and tapped directly into a primitive nerve cluster at the base of my spine. My body, despite the synthetic chemicals flooding my bloodstream, recognized apex predators. Two of them. They were both sitting in the conference area, a sleek glass table surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than my annual salary. Julian was in his usual spot, facing the windows, the morning light catching the silver at his temples. He was 36 but looked younger, with sharp cheekbones and pale gray eyes that could strip a person down to their foundations. Marcus sat opposite him, darker, broader, with eyes the color of aged whiskey and a stillness that made him seem carved from stone. They were dressed in matching charcoal suits, crisp white collars, unbuttoned at the throat, and they were both looking at me. Julian's expression was unreadable. Marcus's was something else. His jaw was tight, the muscle feathering beneath his jawline. I'd never seen him look like that before. Angry? No. Focused. Like I was a structural flaw he was trying to calculate. Shut the door, Nico, Julian said. I closed it. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot. Take a seat. I walked over and sat in the chair opposite them, the one that was equidistant between the two, a strategic placement that felt anything but neutral. The leather was cold. I kept my back rigid, my knees pressed together, my hands folded in my lap. I braced myself. Julian reached out and tapped a single sheet of paper resting in the center of the glass table. I recognized the color coding even upside down. My chest tightened. I received your email last night, Julian said. His voice was smooth, even, with no inflection. Mr. Ashford, my throat felt like it was full of sand. I forced myself to swallow. I apologize. It was a severe lapse in judgment. I was exhausted and I attached the wrong file. I have my resignation letter drafted. I can have my desk cleared by noon. Silence. Julian watched me. He didn't blink. Marcus's whiskey-dark gaze was fixed on my face, tracking every micro-expression, every tremor. The scent of ozone in the room seemed to spike, growing sharper, almost metallic. But beneath it, the cedar deepened, richer, wrapping around the edges of my awareness like a physical weight. Resignation, Julian repeated, tasting the word like it was a foreign concept. He picked up the paper, my medical schedule. You requested this Saturday through Monday off for the Midwest Architectural Symposium in Chicago. I looked down at my hands. Yes. That was a lie to cover my absence. Your heat. Hearing him say the word out loud in this sterile, professional environment felt obscenely intimate. It felt like he had reached across the table and put his hand around my throat. A flush crept up my neck, burning my ears. Yes, I whispered. Marcus leaned forward, his forearms resting on the glass table. The movement was slow, deliberate. Your endocrinologist is Dr. Patel, he said. His voice was rougher than Julian's, a gravelly baritone that seemed to resonate in my bones. Good man. Aggressive with his suppressant protocols. His eyes flicked up to mine. Perhaps too aggressive. I blinked, entirely thrown. You look terrible, Nico, Marcus continued. Dark circles. You've lost at least 10 pounds in the last quarter. And right now, you smell like burnt sugar and panic, masked by a heavy dose of synthetic blockers that are slowly destroying your liver. My breath hitched. He could smell through the blockers. That was impossible, unless the alpha was actively scenting me. Both of them were. The realization made my skin prickle with something that wasn't entirely fear. I'm managing it, I said, my cynical edge flaring up to protect my exposed nerves. It won't affect my work. It never has. As I said, I'll resign. You aren't resigning. Julian's voice cut through the air like a blade. The blankness in his pale gray eyes had shifted, a dangerous, quiet intensity flooding into the irises. You are our best architect, he said. You're meticulous. Driven. You understand load-bearing stresses better than anyone in this firm, including us. We're not losing you to a HR violation. Marcus nodded slowly. However, he added, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, we do not appreciate being lied to. Nor do we appreciate our employees destroying their bodies to fit into a corporate mold. It's just biology, I said. It's an inconvenience. Is it? Julian stood up. He was tall, 6'2", of dense muscle hidden under bespoke tailoring. He walked around the edge of the table. I couldn't help it, my instincts were screaming at me to lower my head, to expose the vulnerable line of my neck. I fought it, keeping my chin painfully level. Julian stopped beside my chair. He didn't touch me. He just stood there, invading my personal space, the heat radiating off his body palpable. Marcus mirrored the movement, rising to stand on my other side. I was flanked, pinned between them, the twin alphas' sense closing in like a vice. You will not go to Chicago this weekend, Julian said softly, looking down at me. You will take your leave. But you are going to stop taking these heavy-duty blockers. Immediately. They're killing you. If I stop taking them, I said, my voice trembling slightly, my cycle will hit harder. It'll be unmanageable. It'll be natural, Julian corrected. And you will manage it. At home. He paused. Marcus stepped closer, his large frame blocking the light from the windows. And until then, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble, you will report directly to us. For everything. I looked up at them, entirely bewildered. I already report to you. Julian leaned down, bracing one hand on the armrest of my chair. He was so close I could see the individual lashes framing his pale gray eyes. His scent washed over me, heavy, possessive, intoxicating. My breath caught in my chest. A low, humiliating ache sparked in my lower belly. You report to us professionally, Nico, Julian murmured, his gaze dropping to the collar of my shirt, right where my pulse was jumping frantically against my scent gland. Starting today, we're taking an active interest in your well-being. Do we understand each other? I couldn't speak. I just nodded. Marcus's hand came down on my shoulder, warm, heavy, anchoring. Good, he said. Now go back to your desk. Send us the actual meridian structural analysis. We expect it within the hour. I practically fled the office. When I sat back down at my desk, my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't type. I felt a dampness on the back of my neck. They hadn't fired me. But as I sat there, inhaling the lingering scent of ozone and cedar that had clung to my clothes, I realized something infinitely more terrifying. Julian and Marcus Ashford had just claimed my calendar. And they were waiting for Saturday. Over the next 3 days, my reality fractured. I followed their orders. I cut my suppressive dosage in half, too terrified of their quiet authority to defy them completely, but too terrified of my own body to quit cold turkey. The withdrawal was brutal. It felt like peeling off a heavy, suffocating wetsuit I'd worn for 6 years. Suddenly the world was too loud, too bright, and far, far too fragrant. The sterile office environment became a minefield. I could smell the anxious, sour sweat of the interns. I could smell the cheap chemical cologne of the beta project managers. But above all, I could smell them, Julian and Marcus. Their scents had changed, deepened. Julian's sharp, impersonal ozone had mellowed into something warmer, more electric, while Marcus's cedar had enriched with a dark, earthy musk that seemed to cling to the walls, the carpeting, the very air filtration system of the 45th floor. It was a snare. And I was walking right into it. They began pulling me into their orbit with agonizing precision. Before, I was a tool they used to build their skyscrapers. Now I was a fixture by their side. "Nico, bring the structural reports," Julian would say over the intercom, his voice a low rumble. I would enter their office, and he wouldn't be behind his desk, he'd be at the drafting table, sleeves rolled up, exposing thick forearms dusted with dark hair. Marcus would be there too, leaning against the windowsill, watching me with those unreadable whiskey eyes. "Look at the cantilever here," Julian murmured on Thursday afternoon, leaning over the table. His shoulder brushed mine. The contact was electric, a jolt went straight down my spine, pooling low in my pelvis. I let out a sharp, involuntary breath. Julian paused. He didn't pull away. He turned his head, his nose inches from my ear. I could feel the heat of his breath against my jaw. He was inhaling slowly, deliberately. "Your scent is changing," Julian noted, his voice a gravelly whisper. I gripped the edge of the drafting table, my knuckles turning white. "It's the withdrawal from the blockers." "No." Marcus shifted, turning his body fully toward me. I was trapped between him and the table. "It's not just withdrawal. It's sweetening. You smell like bruised apples and wild honey." My face burned. Omegas weren't supposed to smell like that in the office. We were supposed to smell like nothing, neutral, professional. To have two alphas comment on my scent was entirely inappropriate. It was a violation of HR policy. But I didn't want to call HR. I wanted to lean into them. My biology, freed from its chemical cage, was recognizing its counterpart. It was screaming at me to submit, to let these massive, capable alphas take the reins. I hated it. I hated the weakness. "I need to get back to my desk," I said, grabbing my tablet. Marcus watched me, his dark gaze hooded. "Go drink some water. You look flushed." By Friday, the physical symptoms of my impending heat began to bleed into my waking life. The air conditioning in the building felt like it was broken. A perpetual low-grade fever burned under my skin. My clothes felt restrictive, the fabric abrasive against my overly sensitive skin. I was at the copy machine in the break room, waiting for a massive stack of permits to print, when it hit me, a dizzying wave of heat that rolled through my body like a tidal wave. I leaned against the counter, my eyes closed, trying to breathe through it. My lower back ached, a deep, rhythmic throbbing that meant my body was preparing. "Not yet," I pleaded silently. "It's only Friday. I have until Saturday. Please. You're in pain." I gasped, my eyes snapping open. Julian was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard him approach, the thick carpeting masked his footsteps. But I should have smelled him. I was so consumed by my own internal fire, I had missed the approaching storm. "I'm fine." I lied, gripping the edge of the counter. "You're lying. Marcus stepped out from behind the door. He'd been there too, waiting. The break room was empty. The hum of the copier was the only sound. Julian reached out. I flinched, expecting him to grab my arm. Instead, his large, warm hand settled gently against the back of my neck. My knees actually buckled. If I hadn't been leaning against the counter, I would have hit the floor. The contact was devastating. His thumb brushed over my scent gland, directly over the pulse point that was hammering like a trapped bird. A choked, pathetic little sound escaped my throat, a whimper. I slapped a hand over my mouth, utterly mortified. No, no, no. Julian's grip on my neck tightened fractionally, supporting, holding my weight. His chest pressed against my back. He was completely enveloping me in his scent, in his heat. Your temperature is through the roof, Nico, Julian murmured, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear. Your cycle isn't waiting until Saturday. It's coming early. It can't, I choked out, tears of frustration pricking my eyes. I have deadlines. Screw the deadlines. Marcus's growl came from behind, territorial and commanding. Your body is reacting to the drop in hormones. He trailed off, his thumb stroking my nape. And it's reacting to us, Julian said softly. You know it is. Our proximity is pushing you into heat. He was right. I knew he was right. Every time they looked at me, every time they stood too close, my body interpreted it as a biological trigger. The copier finished its run, beeping loudly. The spell broke. I tore myself away from Julian, stumbling forward, and grabbed the stack of papers, clutching them to my chest like a shield. My breathing was jagged. Julian stood there, his hand still suspended in the air for a fraction of a second before he lowered it into his pocket. He looked perfectly composed, but his pale gray eyes were black with blown-out pupils. Marcus moved to block the door, his massive frame filling the exit. Pack up your desk, he ordered. The gentleness was gone, replaced by absolute, unyielding authority. We're having our driver take you home. You're done for the week. I can't. Now, Nico. Julian's voice was steel-wrapped in velvet. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I went to my desk, threw my laptop into my bag, and grabbed my coat. My limbs felt heavy, filled with lead. When I got to the elevator bank, both alphas were waiting. They didn't say a word. We rode down in silence, the tension so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Outside, a sleek black town car was idling at the curb. The driver opened the back door. I hesitated, looking back at them. They were standing under the awning of the building, side by side, like twin kings surveying their domain. The wind whipped Julian's tie over his shoulder, and Marcus's hand rested casually on his hip. Go home, Nico, Julian said. Lock your doors. What about the Meridian project? I asked, a desperate, final attempt to cling to my professional reality. Marcus smiled, a predatory baring of teeth that sent a fresh wave of heat straight to my core. We have your schedule, he said softly, the words carrying easily over the noise of the city street. We know exactly where you'll be. I got into the car. The door shut, sealing me in. As the car pulled away, I leaned my burning forehead against the cool, tinted glass and looked back. They were both still standing there, watching, their silhouettes stark against the gray morning light. I had accidentally sent my alpha bosses my heat schedule. And as the first agonizing cramp of my impending cycle twisted in my gut, I realized they weren't going to fire me. They were going to hunt me. My apartment, usually a sterile sanctuary of gray upholstery and glass surfaces, felt like a pressure cooker. I made it inside, engaged the deadbolt and slid the chain into place. My hands were slick with sweat, the metal of the lock slipping against my thumbs. I leaned my back against the heavy door and slid down to the hardwood floor. It started as a dull ache in my joints, radiating outward from my spine. Within an hour, it was a biological wildfire. I dragged myself to the thermostat and cranked the central air down to 60 degrees. It didn't matter. My internal temperature was skyrocketing. My skin felt tight, overly sensitive to the friction of my own clothes. I stripped off my suit jacket, ripping the buttons on my shirt in my haste to get it off. The cotton felt like sandpaper. I kicked off my shoes, leaving them in a pathetic heap in the entryway. Normally, heat cycles were manageable. A heavily medicated haze of mild discomfort, slept off over 3 days with a stockpile of generic suppressants and trash TV. But this was 6 years of suppressed biology crashing into me at terminal velocity. I stumbled into the bathroom. The fluorescent vanity light felt like a physical blow to my retinas. I braced my hands on the edge of the porcelain sink, panting, and stared at the mirror. I looked like a corpse that had been left in the sun. My skin was flushed a chaotic, mottled red. My pupils were entirely blown out, reducing my irises to thin rings of muddy hazel. And the smell, my apartment usually smelled faintly of bleach and drafting vellum. Now the air was thick, suffocatingly sweet. The bruised apple and honey scent the twins had noted was fully blooming, but underneath it was something darker, heavier. Desperation. It was a chemical broadcast screaming into the void, begging for an anchor. I turned on the cold water and splashed it over my face, gasping at the shock. Get it together, Nico. My inner voice sounded thin and panicky. It's just a hormone spike. You are an adult with a mortgage. You have a 401k. I stumbled back into the living room, my legs feeling like wet concrete. My brain, hijacked by instinct, started issuing absurd commands. The leather sofa was too exposed. The bed was too far away. I needed a corner. I needed a barrier. I fought it. I literally stood in the center of my living room and argued with my own endocrine system. I am not building a nest, I growled to the empty room. I am not a damn pigeon. 20 minutes later, I was on my hands and knees, dragging my duvet, 3 sofa cushions, and a pile of unwashed laundry into the narrow space between my bookshelf and the wall. It was humiliating. Every time I tried to stop, a sharp, twisting cramp would seize my lower abdomen, doubling me over until I grabbed another soft item to add to the pile. I curled into the center of it, shivering violently despite the sweat pooling at my collarbone. I pulled a hoodie over my face, one that had accidentally brushed against Julian's coat in the office coat room months ago. It faintly, barely, smelled of ozone. I buried my nose in the fabric, drawing a pathetic, ragged breath. The ghost of his scent provided a fraction of a second of relief, before reality slammed back in. It was wrong. The scent was stale. I needed the ozone. I needed the cedar. I needed both of them. Time lost its rigid structure. It stretched and warped. I drifted in and out of feverish sleep, waking to my own choked whimpers. The sun set, plunging the apartment into deep shadows. Around what felt like midnight, the ache shifted. It stopped being a generalized pain and became a localized, hollow throbbing, deep in my chest and lower stomach. An agonizing emptiness. Then my breath caught. My nose twitched. The air intake vent above my makeshift nest rattled slightly, bleeding through the stale, recycled air of the apartment building, a microscopic trace of something sharp and metallic, ozone, and something deeper, crushed cedar. It was faint, filtered through layers of drywall and hallway carpeting, but my body recognized it instantly. A violent shudder ripped through me. The cramps paused, replaced by a terrifying liquid heat. I dragged the hoodie away from my face, my chest heaving. They were here. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks echoed through the apartment, not the frantic pounding of a concerned neighbor, not the generic rapid tap of a delivery driver. It was measured, commanding. Thud. 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 My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself deeper into the corner. Go away. Please, God, just go away. Nico. Julian's voice was muffled by the thick wood of the door, but the low baritone vibrated straight through the floorboards and into my bones. I let out a shaky breath, biting down on my lower lip so hard I tasted copper. I couldn't ignore them. My brain said stay hidden, but my biology was literally dragging me upright. I untangled myself from the duvet, my legs trembling so violently I had to lean against the wall to stay upright. I stumbled down the short hallway, my bare feet slapping quietly against the hardwood. The scent of ozone and cedar was suffocating now, pooling thick and heavy under the crack of the front door. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood, closing my eyes. Mr. Ashford, I croaked, my voice a ruined, raspy wreck. You shouldn't be here. Open the door, Nico. Julian's tone was absolute, terrifying certainty. I'm in isolation. It's a liability issue. Company policy. We own the company, Marcus cut in, his voice rougher, edged with something that sounded almost like desperation. And we're overriding policy. Marcus's voice was sharp, cutting through the fog of my fever. Open the door, Nico, or we'll have the super unlock it. He's standing right next to us. My eyes snapped open. I looked through the peephole. Julian and Marcus were standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, flanking the door like twin sentinels. They'd ditched their suit jackets and ties, their white dress shirts were unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up. Marcus held a brown paper pharmacy bag in one hand. And true to his word, Mr. Henderson, my terrified-looking building superintendent, was hovering nervously a few feet away, clutching his master key ring like a lifeline. A flush of profound humiliation burned through the fever. They were making a spectacle of me. Fine, I hissed. I undid the deadbolt with a loud clack but kept the chain on. I opened the door exactly 3 inches. Julian's face appeared in the gap. Up close, the gray of his eyes was almost entirely swallowed by the dilated pitch-black pupils of a triggered alpha. Marcus's dark gaze was fixed on mine, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling with controlled, deliberate breaths. The scent rolling off them hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Pure, unfiltered dominance. My knees buckled slightly, and I had to grip the edge of the door to keep from falling. Mr. Henderson, Julian said, not taking his eyes off mine. You can leave us. Yes, sir. Have a good evening, Mr. Ashford. The super practically squeaked, practically running down the hall. Silence descended, heavy and fraught. Julian looked at me through the crack, his gaze dropping from my sweat-slicked hair to my flushed face, down to the ragged collar of my t-shirt where my collarbones were visibly trembling. You look exactly like we knew you would, Marcus murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that made my toes curl into the floorboards. Take the chain off, Julian said. Please, I whispered, my cynical edge gone, melted down by the fever. If you come in here, I don't know what I'll do. I have no blockers left in my system. We know, Marcus said simply, holding up the pharmacy bag. We brought you electrolytes and a microdose of a beta blocker, just enough to stop the physical cramping, but not enough to stall the cycle. Your liver needs a break. They weren't here to take advantage of a drugged omega. They were here to manage me. To care for me. And somehow, that was infinitely more dangerous. My shaking fingers reached for the chain. It rattled against the metal track. I hesitated. "Nico." Julian's voice was softer now, a command wrapped in velvet. "Let us in." I slid the chain free. Julian pushed the door open, stepping over the threshold. Marcus followed, his large frame instantly shrinking the size of my entryway. Julian kicked the door shut behind him with the heel of his shoe. The lock clicked into place, sealing us in. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. The frantic, sour panic of my scent was immediately swallowed up by their heavy, grounding scents, ozone and cedar, static and earth. My lungs, which had been fighting for shallow breaths all evening, suddenly expanded. I took a deep, dragging inhale. It was relief. Immediate, intoxicating relief. I swayed forward, entirely against my own volition. Marcus dropped the bag onto the console table. Julian caught me before I could hit the floor, his large, warm hands gripping my upper arms, holding me steady. The heat radiating off him was incredible, but it didn't burn like my fever. It was a deep, anchoring warmth. "Easy," Julian rumbled. I sagged against his chest, burying my face into his shoulder. I knew I was ruining my career. I knew I was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But the fabric of his shirt smelled so intensely of him, and the solid wall of his chest against mine felt like the only real thing in the world. Marcus was behind me in an instant, his broad chest pressing against my back. I was sandwiched between them, trapped, held, anchored. His hands came up to rest on my hips, steadying me. "You're burning up," Marcus noted, shifting his grip. His palm came to rest against my forehead, cool against my fevered skin. The contrast was heaven. I leaned into his touch, a low, humiliating purr beginning to vibrate in the back of my throat. I tried to swallow it down, horrified by the sound, but I couldn't stop it. Julian's hand slid from my forehead, his long fingers trailing down my flushed cheek, tracing the line of my jaw. He tilted my head back, forcing me to look up at him. Marcus's breath was hot on the back of my neck. "Look at you," Julian breathed, his thumb brushing over my trembling lower lip. "Trying so hard to be professional while you're literally vibrating out of your skin." "I hate you," I choked out, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of my dignity. Both of them smiled, dark, possessive curves of their lips. Julian leaned down, his nose brushing against the crook of my neck, right over my scent gland. I froze, my heart stopping entirely. Marcus echoed the motion on the other side, his mouth hovering over the opposite gland. They inhaled deeply, the sound loud in the quiet apartment. "No, you don't," Julian whispered against my skin, his breath sending violent shivers down my spine. Marcus's voice was a low rumble against my ear. "You're building a nest in your living room, Nico. And you're hoping we're going to fill it." Julian pressed a slow, deliberate kiss against my pounding pulse point. Marcus's teeth grazed the opposite side, not breaking the skin, just a promise. "Show us where it is," they said in unison. My living room looked like the aftermath of a robbery as Julian and Marcus guided me down the short hallway, their arms solid iron bars around my waist. The shame began to burn through the fog of my fever. I tried to drag my feet to stall our momentum, but they just absorbed my dead weight and kept moving. We rounded the corner. The streetlights from the window cut through the dark apartment, illuminating the pathetic pile of bedding, sofa cushions, and dirty laundry wedged between the bookshelf and the wall. It wasn't a nest. It was a cry for help, constructed out of polyblend fabrics and desperation. "Don't look at it," I mumbled, trying to turn my face into Julian's shoulder. The fabric of his shirt was damp with my sweat. I was ruining their clothes. I was ruining my life. "It's embarrassing." Julian and Marcus stopped at the edge of the pile. They didn't laugh. They didn't offer condescending, placating coos. They looked at the frantic arrangement of pillows and the hoodie I had dragged into the center with expressions of quiet, heavy reverence. "It's perfect," Julian said, his voice stripped of its usual corporate polish, rough, scraping against the silence of the room. Marcus nodded slowly. "It's exactly what you needed." They lowered me down. My knees folded immediately. I sank into the duvet, the familiar, stale scent of my own distress rising up around me, but now it was immediately chased by the heavy, rolling thunder of ozone and cedar. They didn't hover over me. They sat down right in the middle of it, Julian on one side, Marcus on the other. Julian Ashford, who owned half the commercial real estate skyline in the city. Marcus Ashford, who could bring a construction site to a halt with a single look. They folded their long legs and settled onto a pile of my unwashed gym shirts and a cheap throw blanket, flanking me like sentinels. The visual was so jarring, so completely disjointed from my reality, that a short, broken laugh punched out of my chest. It sounded like a sob. "Drink," Julian commanded gently. I hadn't even noticed he'd brought the pharmacy bag with him. He cracked the seal on a bottle of electrolyte water, the plastic snapped sharply, and held it to my lips. My hands were shaking too badly to hold it, so I let him tip it back. The liquid was aggressively cold, tasting artificially of lemon and salt. I choked on the first swallow, coughing violently. Julian's large hand immediately went to the back of my neck, his thumb massaging the tense cords of muscle at the base of my skull. "Slow down. Breathe, Nico." Marcus pressed a tiny white pill against my lips. "Open." I opened my mouth, letting him slip the beta blocker onto my tongue. He tipped the water bottle up again. I swallowed, the bitter chalkiness lingering in the back of my throat. "Give it 10 minutes, Julian said, setting the bottle aside. "It'll stop the muscle spasms. It won't stop the heat." I slumped back against a sofa cushion, pulling my knees to my chest. I felt exposed, stripped raw. "Why did you bring that?" I asked, my voice a raspy whisper. "Alphas, they usually want an omega fully out of their mind. It makes them more compliant." Marcus's jaw tightened. A flash of genuine anger darkened his whiskey eyes. "We don't want compliance, Nico," he said, his tone dangerously soft. "We employ a building full of compliant people. They bore the hell out of us." Julian shifted closer, the mattress pad I dragged onto the floor dipping under his weight. "We want the man who argues with us over the structural integrity of steel beams," he murmured, reaching out, his knuckles brushing against my damp cheek. "We want the architect who glares at us when we reject his drafts. We want you awake for this." The words hit me like a physical blow. The last 6 years of my life had been dedicated to erasing my biology so I could be seen for my mind. I had starved myself of comfort, poisoned my liver with suppressants, all to prove I wasn't just a collection of instincts. And here were Julian and Marcus, the apex of my professional anxiety, telling me they saw both. And they wanted both. A profound, terrifying crack echoed through my internal defenses. I felt like a load-bearing column finally giving way under a stress it was never designed to hold. The beta blocker began to work. The sharp, stabbing cramps in my lower abdomen dulled into a heavy, pulling ache. But as the pain retreated, the sheer, unadulterated need rushed in to fill the vacuum. My body felt impossibly heavy, yet my skin buzzed with static electricity. Every breath I took was saturated with them, Julian's ozone, Marcus's cedar. They were intoxicating, grounding my frantic heartbeat while sparking deep, liquid heat between my thighs. "Julian. Marcus." I breathed. Their names tasted foreign and necessary on my tongue. I didn't think about it. I couldn't. I uncoiled my legs and dragged myself across the few inches of duvet separating us, crawling into the space between them. They let out harsh, ragged sounds, something between groans and growls. Their arms banded around me, crushing me against their chests. Julian's hand buried itself in my damp hair, Marcus's gripped my thigh, his long fingers digging into the muscle. I buried my face in the crook of Julian's neck, the scent strongest there, right over his pulse point. I opened my mouth and dragged my teeth lightly against his collarbone through the fabric of his shirt. Marcus's mouth was on my throat in an instant, mirroring the gesture. Julian shuddered, the immovable alpha actually shuddered. "Nico," he rasped, his breath hot against my ear. "If you do that again, we are going to tear these shirts off. And we are not going to be gentle." Marcus's teeth grazed my scent gland, not quite breaking the skin. "Say it," he demanded. "Tell us you want this." I closed my eyes. The cynicism, the fear, the carefully constructed walls of my corporate persona, they all burned away, leaving nothing but raw, perfect instinct. "Then tear it off," I whispered. The sound of cotton tearing was deafening in the quiet room. Julian didn't bother with buttons, he gripped the lapels of his ruined dress shirt and pulled outward, the fabric giving way with a sharp rip, buttons pinging against the hardwood floor. Marcus followed suit, his own shirt joining the pile. They shrugged off the ruined garments, tossing them blindly into the shadows. The heat radiating from their bare skin was a furnace. I flattened my palms against their chests, musculature dense, carved out of stone, dusted with dark hair that felt slightly rough beneath my sensitive fingertips. I could feel the frantic, heavy thud of their hearts. They matched mine, beat for beat. I pushed myself up, straddling Julian's thighs, my back pressed against Marcus's chest. The friction of my jeans against Julian's slack sent a jolt of pure white lightning straight to my core. I gasped, throwing my head back. Marcus took advantage of the exposure. Instantly, his mouth descended on my neck, not a gentle kiss, but open-mouthed, wet, desperate claiming. His teeth scraped against my collarbone, dragging upward toward the highly sensitive skin of my scent gland. Julian's hands were on my hips, gripping, guiding. "Ah!" I cried out, my hands instinctively flying up to grip Julian's shoulders. My nails dug half-moons into his skin. They were scenting me deeply, both of them, at once. Julian's tongue swept over the pulse point at my jaw while Marcus's mouth worked the opposite side, tasting the heavy, honeyed sweat that coated my skin. They were overriding the stale smell of my apartment, overriding the chemical residue of the suppressants. They were drowning me in ozone and cedar, painting my skin with their claim before they even broke the surface. Bruised apples and honey, Julian growled against my throat, his voice vibrating right against my vocal cords. "God, you're so sweet underneath all that armor." It's just biology," I stammered, a final, pathetic attempt at rational thought. My brain was desperately trying to tread water in a sea of hormones. "It's just the heat." Marcus pulled back, his eyes entirely black now, the whiskey iris swallowed by instinct. "Shut up," he commanded, his hands dropping to my hips, his grip bruising. "Stop analyzing it. Stop fighting us." He rolled his hips upward, pressing the hard, heavy ridge of his arousal directly against my center. A choked, humiliating whine ripped out of my throat. My spine bowed. The hollow ache inside me flared into an agonizing void. I needed weight. I needed pressure. I needed them to anchor me before I floated away completely. I leaned down, crushing my mouth against Julian's. The kiss was a collision, messy, all teeth and bruising pressure. He tasted like black coffee and power. I opened my mouth for him completely, letting his tongue sweep inside, taking whatever he wanted. Marcus's mouth was on my neck, biting, sucking, leaving marks that would bloom into bruises by morning. I had no resistance left. I didn't want any. The taste of them was a sedative and a stimulant all at once. My hands tangled in Julian's dark hair, pulling him closer, closer, until I couldn't tell where my fever ended and his heat began. Marcus's hands moved frantically over my body, gripping the hem of my t-shirt and yanking it over my head in one fluid motion, tossing it aside. The cold air of the apartment hit my sweat-slicked skin, but I barely registered it before Julian was pulling me flush against his bare chest. Skin to skin. Marcus pressed against my back, his chest rumbling with a low, possessive growl. A heavy rolling purr erupted from my chest. I couldn't stop it, the vibration rattled against both of them, trapped between their bodies. There it is, Julian murmured, his hands tracing the line of my spine, pressing me tighter against them. There's our Omega. The word should have disgusted me. It should have sent me running for the door. But hearing it from them, in this nest, bathed in their scents, it felt like the click of a deadbolt sliding perfectly into place. Marcus pushed me backward. I fell onto the pile of pillows, gasping as the air was knocked out of me. Julian followed immediately, settling his heavy frame over mine, caging me in. His knees boxed my hips, his forearms planted on either side of my head. Marcus flanked us, positioning himself beside me, his hand finding my thigh, squeezing. Julian stared down at me. Marcus's gaze burned into the side of my face. The sheer, terrifying weight of their attention was almost too much to bear. You sent us your schedule, Julian said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that made my vision blur. It was an accident, I breathed, my chest heaving, my bare skin flushed a deep feverish red. I don't care, Julian replied. He lowered his head, his lips hovering an inch above my scent gland. The skin there was practically vibrating, engorged and hypersensitive. Marcus mirrored the motion on the other side, his teeth grazing the opposite gland. You gave us the map, Nico, Marcus growled. And we're taking the territory. Please, I whimpered, my hands fluttering up, burying themselves in their hair. I wasn't pushing them away. I was holding them there. Say it, Julian demanded, his breath ghosting over the gland. The proximity was a physical agony. Tell us you want this. Tell us to take it. My cynical, practical mind screamed one final protest, they're your bosses. This is career suicide. You are losing yourself. But the alphas above me let out low, rumbling growls of absolute need, and the protest burned to ash. Take it, I sobbed, arching my neck to offer them the perfect angle. Please. Mark me. They didn't hesitate. Julian opened his mouth, his jaw unhinging slightly, and buried his face in my neck. Marcus did the same on the other side. I felt the blunt pressure of their teeth, the wet slide of their tongues, and then the sharp, exquisite pain of their canines breaking the skin. The initial puncture wasn't romantic. It was violent, blinding shock. Julian's canines broke the fragile skin over my scent gland with brutal efficiency, and Marcus's followed an instant later on the opposite side. A sharp, white-hot line of agony flared up both sides of my neck, so intense my vision completely whitened out for a fraction of a second. I screamed, not a sexy, breathless sound, but a raw, tearing noise of pure animal panic. My hands, which had been holding them, instantly turned into claws. I dug my nails into their shoulders, thrashing blindly, my rational brain screaming that I was dying, that my throat was being ripped out. But they were mountains falling on top of me. Julian absorbed my thrashing without shifting an inch, one of his massive hands sliding up to the crown of my head, holding me firmly in place against the pillows. Marcus's heavy hips pinned my legs down, his free hand gripping my wrist. They didn't let up. They bit deeper. Then the venom hit. It didn't feel like a chemical. It felt like a physical wave of liquid gold pouring directly into my bloodstream, rushing out from the bites and flooding my chest. The agonizing pain warped, twisting instantly into a profound, suffocating euphoria. My spine went completely slack. The fight died in my muscles, my hands falling limply from their shoulders to rest against their damp backs. A heavy, wet sob tore out of my throat, but it was a sound of absolute surrender. Their scents changed the second their venom mixed with my blood. The sharp warning crack of ozone vanished, replaced by an overpowering, suffocating blanket of crushed cedar and dark, rich earth. It was the scent of a locked vault. It was possession. Julian pulled back first, his chest heaving, his mouth slick with saliva and a smear of my blood. His pale gray eyes were completely gone, nothing but blown-out, bottomless black wells of instinct. Marcus followed, his whiskey eyes just as dark, just as lost. They both looked down at my neck, at the deep, bleeding crescent moons they had just carved into my flesh. A low, terrifyingly satisfied rumble vibrated in their chests, in unison. Mine, Julian breathed. Ours, Marcus corrected, his voice rough and final. Yours, I whimpered back. I couldn't have lied if I wanted to. The bond was already wrapping around my brain, silencing 6 years of cynical independence in less than 5 seconds. They didn't give me time to process the sheer magnitude of what I had just done. The heat had reached its absolute zenith, fueled by the fresh, raw bond. Julian dragged my sweat-soaked jeans down my hips, his hands rough and entirely devoid of the careful corporate restraint he exercised in the office. Marcus kicked the denim away, leaving me completely bare in the center of the pathetic pile of cushions and dirty laundry. I didn't care. The shame was gone. What followed wasn't gentle making love. It was a biological necessity executed with frantic, messy desperation. Julian pushed inside me first, and the stretch and fullness was so overwhelming I saw stars. I arched off the floor, a broken cry shattering the quiet of the apartment. Marcus caught my hips, his fingers bruising the soft flesh of my thighs, anchoring me to the earth as Julian began to move. Marcus was behind me, his chest pressed to my back, his mouth on my neck, his hands everywhere. The friction was agonizingly good. It was loud, skin slapping against skin, the harsh, ragged sound of our breathing, the muffled thud of the mattress pad against the hardwood floor. I tasted copper from biting my own lip. I tasted the salt of their sweat when they leaned down to crush their mouths against mine. Every thrust drove the bond deeper. I felt the exact moment their control snapped, their rhythm turned jagged, punishing. Julian buried his face in the crook of my neck, right over the raw, bleeding mark. Marcus's teeth found the other side, biting down again, not breaking the skin but making his claim known. A final, guttural shout ripped from both of them, rattling against my collarbone. They flooded me, together, in perfect sync. The knots at the base of their anatomy swelled, locking us together with brutal, unavoidable finality. I shattered around them. The climax ripped through me like a physical earthquake, my muscles locking up, my toes curling so hard they cramped. I sobbed openly into the dark room, tears of overwhelming relief and absolute terror streaking through the sweat on my face. We lay there in the wreckage of my living room, locked together, completely immobilized by our own biology. The silence of the apartment slowly crept back in, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged sound of the alphas trying to catch their breath against my skin. I was tethered to them, physically, chemically, permanently. I closed my eyes. The heavy narcotic of the alpha's bites pulled me under into a deep, dreamless void. For the first time in 6 years, the spreadsheet in my head was completely blank. The light woke me. It wasn't the soft, forgiving light of dawn, it was the harsh, aggressive glare of a Sunday afternoon bleeding through the gaps in my cheap plastic blinds. I tried to turn over, and my body instantly screamed in protest. My lower back ached with a deep, hollow soreness. My hips felt bruised. But worse than the physical ache was the immediate, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. An arm, the size of a steel girder, was wrapped securely around my waist, pinning my back firmly against a broad, impossibly hot chest. Another arm was draped over my hips from the other side, heavy and possessive. I was sandwiched between them, completely trapped. Reality crashed down on me, completely devoid of the feverish haze that had protected me the night before. The heat was over. The biological storm had passed. I was lying naked on a pile of sofa cushions with the CEOs of Ashford. I stopped breathing. My eyes darted around the room. The apartment looked like a crime scene, ripped clothing scattered across the floor, the pharmacy bag crushed near the doorway, the air thick, heavy, and stale. A claustrophobic cocktail of sex, sweat, bruised apples, and a terrifyingly dominant blend of ozone and cedar. Slowly, terrifyingly, my hand crept up to the sides of my neck. My fingers brushed against raised, swollen flesh, 2 sets of deep, scabbed indentations, one on each side, right over my scent glands. Twin marks. It wasn't a fever dream. It was a permanent, undeniable physical contract. A cold spike of panic, pure, cynical corporate panic, drove a wedge through the lingering warmth of the bond. What had I done? I was ruined. HR would have a field day. The board of directors would crucify us all. They'd have to fire me to save face, or worse, keep me on as some sort of glorified, bonded pet in the drafting room. My breathing hitched, growing shallow and rapid. My scent spiked, souring instantly with distress. The arms around me tightened like a vice. Stop thinking. Julian's voice rumbled directly into my ear. I flinched. He shifted behind me, his heavy chest rubbing against my bare spine. Marcus's hand squeezed my hip, grounding. He's right, Marcus murmured, his voice rough with sleep. We can hear your heart racing. Mr. Ashford, I croaked, my throat feeling like it was lined with broken glass. We what? We bonded, Julian said calmly. You went into heat. We claimed you. It's a disaster, I whispered, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. I tried to pull away, to sit up, but they just clamped down harder, refusing to yield an inch. The firm. The conflict of interest. HR protocols. You're the senior partners. I'm just a junior architect. Julian let out a harsh, dismissive breath. He reached up, his large hand wrapping around my throat, not squeezing, but his thumb deliberately brushing over the raw, tender bite mark on the right side. Marcus mirrored the gesture on the left, his thumb tracing the twin wound. A jolt of pure electricity shot down my spine. The panic instantly short-circuited, overridden by the brutal authority of the alphas who had marked me. Do you think we give a single damn about HR protocols? Marcus said, his voice cold and flat. We built that firm. We own the building. We write the policies. They'll talk, I argued miserably, staring at a stain on my hardwood floor. They'll say I slept my way up. They'll look at my blueprints and see your teeth in my neck. Julian shifted, rolling us both over so he was hovering above me. Marcus moved to the side, propping himself up on one elbow, his dark gaze fixed on my face. The light from the window illuminated their features, they looked entirely different. The immaculate, untouchable CEOs were gone. They were unshaven, their hair a mess, dark circles under their eyes. But they looked completely, terrifyingly grounded. Let them talk, Julian stated simply. You are an exceptional architect, Nico. You are also our Omega. Those two facts are not mutually exclusive. We are not hiding this. And we are certainly not hiding you. I swallowed hard. Tears of sheer exhaustion pricked my eyes. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a subordinate and a mate. The power dynamic, it's a mess. It is a mess, Marcus agreed, his tone softening a fraction. He lowered his head, resting his forehead against mine. Julian mirrored the gesture on my other temple. The contact was shockingly intimate, both of them, pressed close. We will figure it out. You will argue with us over load-bearing walls in the boardroom. And you will submit to us in our bed. We will draw the lines together. Julian pressed a firm, lingering kiss against the corner of my mouth. Marcus echoed it on the other side. But understand this, Julian murmured, pulling back just enough to look me in the eye. The black pupils had receded, but the gray irises were like steel. You are not resigning. You are taking the rest of the week off to recover. And on Monday, you are coming back to the office. And you are taking the desk inside our office. My cynical brain wanted to argue. It wanted to scream about optics and professionalism and independence. But as I lay there, surrounded by the wreckage of my heat, breathing in the heavy, protective scent of their scents, ozone and cedar, lightning and forest, the fight just drained out of me. The exhausting, 6-year war I had waged against my own biology was over. I had lost. And looking up at the ruthless, immovable alphas who were currently sitting on a pile of my dirty laundry, I realized I didn't care. Monday, I whispered back, my voice barely holding together. Inside your office. Julian smiled, not the predatory baring of teeth from outside the building, but a genuine, possessive curve of his lips. Marcus's hand found mine, squeezing. Good boy, Julian rumbled. Marcus pressed a kiss to my forehead. That's our Omega. They leaned down together to claim my mouth, Julian on one side, Marcus on the other, and for the first time in my life, I didn't calculate the risks. I just closed my eyes and let the architecture of my old life collapse entirely. Epilogue, 6 months later. The 45th floor of Ashford had changed. The frosted glass doors were gone, replaced by a single, sweeping glass wall that opened onto a sprawling corner office. Inside, 3 drafting tables sat side by side. 3 monitors. 3 chairs. Mine was in the middle. I looked up from the blueprints spread across my desk. The Meridian Tower was finally going to break ground next month, and watched Julian and Marcus argue over the placement of a support beam. They were standing at the main drafting table, sleeves rolled up, their scents, ozone and cedar, sharp and deep, filling the space like a second skin. They both looked up at the same time, as if sensing my gaze. Problem? Julian asked, one eyebrow raised. I smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that still felt new. You're going to compromise the integrity of the eastern facade. Marcus snorted. You're the one who drew it. Exactly. I pushed back from my desk, walking over to stand between them. And I drew it correctly. Julian's hand found the small of my back, warm and possessive. Marcus's fingers brushed against the collar of my shirt, his thumb tracing the faded scar on the left side of my neck, the mark that had healed into a permanent, pale silver crescent. We'll discuss it at dinner, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that made my toes curl. Marcus leaned in, his lips brushing my ear. And then we'll discuss it in the car. And then we'll discuss it at home. I rolled my eyes, but I was smiling. You're insufferable. 2 alphas, Julian said, his hands sliding up my spine. 1 Omega. We're biologically designed to be insufferable. Marcus's laugh rumbled through his chest, warm, genuine. It's part of the charm. I looked between them, these immovable, impossible, infuriating alphas who had turned my carefully ordered world upside down. 6 months ago, I would have walked out of this building and never looked back. Now, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. So, I said, leaning into both of them. Dinner. Then the car. Then home. Julian's smile was sharp and possessive. Then we mark you again. Marcus's teeth grazed the opposite side of my neck. And again. I shivered, despite myself. That, I said, pulling away from them to gather my blueprints, is a terrible idea. We have an early meeting tomorrow. But I was still smiling as I walked away. And I knew, as I stepped into the elevator with 2 alphas flanking me, their hands finding mine, that I had never been safer. Never been more wanted. Never been more mine. The send button had been an accident. The bond was not. The end.